Michael had always believed in hard work and persistence. From a young age, he dreamed of building something great. Through years of dedication, he turned a small idea into a thriving business. His company was now stable, profitable, and ready to grow. To take the next step, he needed a loan. Not just any loan, one that would help him expand into new markets. He had done his research, prepared all the necessary documents, and made sure his credit was perfect. He was confident. On a bright morning, Michael walked into one of the most prestigious banks in the city. The kind of bank that funded big businesses and handled millions in transactions every day. The bank was housed in a towering glass building with a sleek marble lobby and suited bankers moving with purpose. He had chosen this bank for a reason. They had the resources to approve large loans, and he believed his financials spoke for themselves. Yet, as he approached the receptionist, he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. This bank had a history. It wasn't a secret that they preferred a certain kind of client. Many Black entrepreneurs had walked in with high hopes and walked out with nothing. The stories were whispered in business circles, but Michael refused to be discouraged by them. He adjusted his suit, straightened his posture, and reminded himself he had earned his place at the table. He wasn't here asking for favors. He was here as a successful businessman, ready to take his company to the next level. With confidence, he stepped forward, greeted the receptionist, and asked to speak with a loan officer. His appointment had been scheduled. Now, all he had to do was wait. Michael sat in the sleek, air-conditioned office, waiting for the senior banker to arrive. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of his chair. He had been in many boardrooms, had negotiated big deals, and had seen success. Yet something about this moment felt different. He wasn't nervous. He was prepared. The door opened, and in walked Mr. Carter. He was an older man, dressed in an expensive navy suit with a stiff posture and an expression that barely concealed his disinterest. His handshake was quick, almost reluctant, as he took a seat behind his massive mahogany desk. "So, Mr. Johnson," Mr. Carter said, glancing at the file in front of him. "You're looking for a loan?" Michael nodded. "Yes, my company has been growing rapidly, and we need additional funding to scale operations." Mr. Carter hummed, flipping through the paperwork without real interest. "And what kind of business do you run?" Michael explained his company's success, its steady revenue, its expansion plan, its profitability. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. But as he spoke, he noticed something in Mr. Carter's eyes. A coldness, a decision already made. Mr. Carter leaned back, sighing. "You've done well for yourself," he said, but his tone was dismissive. "I'm just curious. How did you manage to build something like this?" Michael frowned slightly. "Through hard work, smart investments, and a great team." Mr. Carter smirked. "No financial help from family? No. Special backing?" Michael clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "No. Just business acumen and persistence." Mr. Carter nodded slowly, as if doubting every word. He flipped another page, then shook his head. "These numbers are impressive," he admitted. "But I'm concerned about long-term stability. These kinds of businesses can be unpredictable." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Unpredictable? My financials show consistent growth year after year. We have contracts secured for the next 3 years. Stability isn't an issue." Mr. Carter smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I understand, but banks have to be cautious. We can't take unnecessary risks." Michael leaned forward slightly. "I have a near-perfect credit score. My assets exceed the loan amount. There's no risk here." Mr. Carter's fingers drummed against his desk. He didn't look at the documents anymore. He didn't need to. His mind had been made up the moment Michael walked in. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," he said, closing the file. "We won't be able to approve your loan." Michael's expression remained calm, but inside, frustration boiled. "Why?" "It's just not the right fit for us. Mr. Carter said vaguely. Perhaps you could try a smaller bank, one that specializes in businesses like yours. Michael exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Businesses like mine? You mean successful businesses? Mr. Carter's lips curled into a tight smile. I mean businesses that might find other lenders more accommodating. Silence stretched between them. Michael had faced discrimination before, but there was something infuriating about the way Mr. Carter delivered it. So polite, so measured, as if he was doing Michael a favor. Michael collected his papers and stood. Thank you for your time. Mr. Carter nodded, already looking past him as if he no longer existed. As Michael walked out of the bank, humiliation sat heavy on his chest. But it didn't break him. He had built something from nothing. He had overcome obstacles before, and he would overcome this too. Michael sat in his office, his hands resting on his desk as he stared at the financial documents spread before him. His team gathered around, sensing his frustration. The rejection at the bank still lingered in his mind, not because he needed their money, but because of the principle of it. I had everything in order, he said, shaking his head. Perfect credit, strong revenue, secured contracts. And he still denied me. His financial advisor, Lisa, leaned forward. It wasn't about numbers, Michael. It was about you. Michael nodded. He had known that from the moment he stepped into Mr. Carter's office. So, what do we do now? We could try other banks, said Jamal, one of his longtime business partners. There are institutions that focus on minority-owned businesses. Michael sighed. I appreciate that, but I refuse to go somewhere just because they see me as a charity case. I built this company through strategy and intelligence. I won't beg for approval from people who don't respect me. Lisa tapped her pen against her notepad, thinking. Then maybe we don't ask for a loan at all. Michael raised an eyebrow. Go on. She glanced at Jamal, then back at Michael. You have the capital. More importantly, you have the network. We could explore other options, private funding, investment partnerships. Jamal suddenly snapped his fingers. Wait, what if we think bigger? What if we don't just look for funding? He leaned in. What if we go after the bank itself? Michael frowned. What do you mean? Buy them out, Jamal said, his voice gaining excitement. Take control of the very institution that tried to shut you out. Lisa's eyes widened. That might not be as crazy as it sounds. Michael leaned back, considering the idea. It was bold. It was almost ridiculous. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. I don't even know if that bank is for sale, Michael said. Lisa grabbed her tablet and started typing. Then let's find out. A few minutes later, she looked up, eyes glinting. You're not going to believe this. Michael and Jamal both turned to her. The bank isn't doing as well as they project, she said. They've been quietly selling off assets. Their liquidity is low, and their loan approval rates have been decreasing. That's a sign of internal struggles. Jamal grinned. And when a bank starts struggling, that means one thing. Ownership might be willing to negotiate. Michael's mind was already racing. He had spent years making powerful connections. Investors, real estate moguls, financial experts. He knew the right people. If this was possible, he could make it happen. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Then he dialed. Who are you calling? Lisa asked. An old friend, Michael said as the line rang. A deep voice answered. Michael Johnson. Been a while. Hey, Marcus, Michael said, getting straight to the point. I need some information on a certain bank. Marcus, a real estate developer with ties to financial institutions, chuckled. You always come to me when you're up to something. What's the bank? Michael gave him the name. There was a brief silence before Marcus responded. Interesting choice. What's your angle? Michael smirked. Let's just say they made a mistake, and I want to fix it. Marcus laughed. I like the sound of that. Lucky for you, I know some of the shareholders. They've been looking for a way out for months. If you're serious, I can make some calls. I'm serious, Michael said. Set up the conversation. Give me an hour, Marcus replied. I'll get back to you. Michael hung up, his heartbeat steady. The humiliation he felt walking out of that bank earlier was gone, replaced by something stronger: determination. He looked at Lisa and Jamal. If this works, we're not just getting a loan. Jamal grinned. We're taking over. Lisa nodded. And they'll never see it coming. Michael exhaled slowly, his mind already strategizing. He had always believed in playing the long game. This was no different. He wasn't just going to change the rules. He was about to own the entire game. Michael didn't waste a second. The moment he hung up with Marcus, he turned to his team. We move fast, he said. If what Marcus says is true, we have a window of opportunity. I want this bank by morning. Lisa nodded, already making calls. Jamal reached for his laptop, pulling up valuation reports and potential financing structures. They had the capital, but this deal needed to be handled strategically. An hour later, Marcus called back. You won't believe this, he said. The shareholders are desperate. They've been trying to offload their stakes for months, but haven't found the right buyer. Michael smiled. Well, they just found one. Here's the best part, Marcus continued. They don't care who buys it. They just want out before things get worse. Michael exchanged a look with Lisa and Jamal. This was playing out better than they could have hoped. Let's not give them time to think, Michael said. I want a proposal on their desk tonight. Lisa and Jamal got to work. They structured an offer through intermediaries, ensuring Michael's name didn't appear right away. The bank's leadership had no idea who was behind the purchase. They only saw a serious investor willing to inject money into their sinking ship. By midnight, the paperwork was in motion. The shareholders, seeing no better option, signed without hesitation. The deal closed faster than anyone had expected. Michael Johnson was now the majority owner of the very bank that had denied him a loan less than 24 hours ago. Morning came. The city buzzed with its usual energy. Employees at the bank filed in, coffee in hand, expecting an ordinary day. The air smelled of freshly brewed espresso, the floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the hum of financial transactions filled the halls. Mr. Carter arrived precisely at 8:30 a.m., as he always did. He adjusted his tie, straightened his cuffs, and stepped through the glass doors with the same arrogance he carried every morning. To him, today was just another day. Another opportunity to turn away applicants he deemed unfit for their loans. Another day to remind people like Michael Johnson that they didn't belong. But today was different. Something felt off. There was an unusual energy in the office. Whispers spread between employees, cautious glances exchanged behind desks. Some looked excited, others nervous. Mr. Carter frowned, stepping toward the receptionist. What's going on? The young woman hesitated. The board called a meeting. Everyone's supposed to be there in 10 minutes. Mr. Carter checked his watch. A board meeting? He hadn't been informed. He was a senior banker. He should have been given notice. With a sigh of irritation, he straightened his tie and made his way to the conference room. Inside, most of the senior staff was already seated, murmuring among themselves. The board members looked tense. Something big was happening. Mr. Carter took his usual seat, tapping his fingers on the table. Would someone care to explain? He asked, his tone laced with impatience. One of the board members, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, cleared his throat. There's been a change in ownership. Mr. Carter sat up straighter. A change? The board member nodded. The bank was sold last night. The new owner will be addressing us shortly. Mr. Carter blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. Sold? Just like that? Before he could ask another question, the door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. And then Mr. Carter saw him. Michael Johnson walked in, confident and composed, his sharp suit crisp, his presence commanding. He strode to the head of the table and took a seat, the seat of power. The room fell into stunned silence. Mr. Carter felt the blood drain from his face. His heart pounded against his ribs. It couldn't be. Michael met his eyes, and for the first time, Mr. Carter saw something he hadn't expected. Power. Not just success, not just money. Power. Michael folded his hands on the table and let the silence stretch, letting them all absorb what had just happened. Finally, he spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "As many of you have heard, there have been some developments. As of last night, I am the new majority owner of this bank." Gasps rippled across the room. Some employees exchanged nervous glances, while others struggled to keep their expressions neutral. Mr. Carter swallowed, his mouth dry. Michael continued, his gaze steady. "I wanted to introduce myself personally because there will be some immediate changes. This bank will no longer operate the way it has in the past. Moving forward, we will ensure fair lending practices. We will support businesses based on their merit, not based on personal bias." The message was clear. The people in the room understood exactly what he was saying. Michael looked directly at Mr. Carter. "And those who cannot align with these values are welcome to leave." A heavy silence followed. Mr. Carter felt the weight of every eye in the room. His arrogance, his sense of control, it was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Fear. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had no interest in humiliating Mr. Carter. That wasn't his goal. His goal was bigger. He wasn't just taking a stand for himself. He was taking a stand for every person who had ever been denied, dismissed, or disrespected simply because of who they were. And Mr. Carter knew in that moment that he had lost. Mr. Carter sat in his office, trying to make sense of the morning's events. The whispers, the shocked expressions, the stunned silence in the boardroom, it all played in his mind like a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. Michael Johnson owned the bank now. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. The receptionist poked her head in, looking hesitant. "Mr. Carter, the new owner would like to see you in his office." For the first time in years, Mr. Carter hesitated before standing. He adjusted his suit, smoothed his tie, and forced himself to walk with the same confidence he always carried. But his palms were sweaty. His heartbeat was unsteady. He had spent his entire career making decisions based on his own version of the world. Today, he had to answer for them. As he reached the executive floor, the hallway felt longer than usual. Every step echoed louder. Finally, he reached the office, the same office where the previous owner once sat. But today, it was different. He stepped inside. Michael sat behind the large desk, the morning light casting shadows across the room. He was calm, composed, powerful. The same man who had once sat on the other side of the desk, asking for a loan. Now, he controlled everything. "Have a seat, Mr. Carter," Michael said. Mr. Carter swallowed hard but sat across from him, trying to keep his composure. Michael studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know why you're here." Mr. Carter forced a tight smile. "I assume it's to discuss operations moving forward." Michael didn't react to the attempt at formality. "It's to discuss changes." He leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "I won't waste time. This bank will no longer operate under biased and unethical practices. Effective immediately, fair lending policies will be enforced. That means no more discrimination, no more turning away qualified applicants because of personal prejudices." Mr. Carter shifted in his seat. Michael raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not interested in excuses," he said. "I'm interested in results." Mr. Carter's face twitched. He was used to being in control, to making the rules. But this was new. He had no power here. Michael continued. "You had an opportunity to do the right thing. You had a chance to see people for their qualifications, their hard work, their merit. Instead, you chose to see color first." Mr. Carter's lips parted as if to protest, but nothing came out. He knew there was no argument that would save him. Michael let the silence stretch. Then he leaned back. "Now, you have a choice." Mr. Carter tensed. "You can stay," Michael said. "But if you do, you will follow the new policies without exception. That means treating every customer with the fairness and respect they deserve." He let his words sink in before continuing. "Or you can leave." Mr. Carter's fingers curled slightly on the armrest of his chair. He had spent decades at this bank. He had built his career on decisions he now realized had consequences. For the first time in his life, he was being held accountable. The weight of it crushed him. Michael watched him closely. He wasn't angry. He didn't want revenge. He simply wanted change. Mr. Carter inhaled sharply. He had always believed he was untouchable, that he was the one who decided who belonged in this world and who didn't. But today, the world had changed. He looked at Michael, who sat in the chair that had once symbolized power over him. Mr. Carter had lost, and there was nothing he could do about it. Change happened fast. Under Michael's leadership, the bank transformed. New policies were put in place to ensure fairness in lending. Loan approvals were based on financial merit, not personal bias. Entrepreneurs from all backgrounds, who had once been turned away, now had a real chance. Word spread quickly. Minority-owned businesses, startups, and hard-working individuals who had been overlooked for years finally had access to financial support. The bank's reputation, once stained by exclusivity and discrimination, began to shift. Michael made sure of it. Community outreach programs were launched, financial literacy workshops were hosted, and new partnerships were formed. The bank was no longer just a place for the privileged few. It was now a resource for everyone. But not everyone could accept this change. Mr. Carter lasted a few weeks under the new leadership. He tried to adjust, but deep down, he couldn't. The power he once held was gone. The authority he wielded over who deserved wealth and who didn't had vanished. One morning, he quietly placed his resignation on Michael's desk. He didn't ask for a conversation. He didn't say goodbye. He simply walked out of the building, never to return. Michael glanced at the resignation letter before setting it aside. He had expected it. Some people couldn't evolve. But he wasn't leading for them. He was leading for the future. As the months passed, the bank flourished. Customers who had once been turned away now walked in with confidence. More businesses grew, more families thrived, and more dreams were funded. Michael had not only changed a bank, he had changed an industry. His story became an inspiration. People who had been told no saw what was possible. Entrepreneurs who had been overlooked realized they weren't alone. Michael never set out for revenge. He set out for change, and in the end, he got exactly that.